Hi BookTube. You may wonder why I'm here back in the first week of October, why I would be reporting on finished readings for October, but I have endeavored this thing. I'm calling it 80 books in 80 days, which means you'll probably be getting weekly updates from me in the BookTube stratosphere, or bi-weekly depending on usually I do bi-weekly, or no, I do monthly, or bi-weekly depending on how many I actually accomplish. Right now I'm going strong, so I'm doing good, and that's 80 books in 80 days with the Penguin Little Black Classics. Prior to my husband leaving for this deployment, or I think it might have been during the workups for this deployment, he bought me the full 80 sets of Little Black Classics, and I decided that I was going to, starting in October, I was going to do one book a day. And I don't know why I picked October to start it. I did. It was an arbitrary date I picked. So 80 books in 80 days. I've been documenting it on my Instagram, and in the meantime, I also read other things, so I think that just doing it weekly or bi-weekly is going to be beneficial. So this is a wrap-up for the first week of October. As I spoke about, I was reading Animal Dreams by Barbara Kingsolver. I finished this book, and so we follow a pair of twins. One is kind of part of me wants to say one of them has a savior complex. I don't necessarily know that she has a savior's complex, or that she just has an inborn need to constantly help people, and that becomes a driving force in her life. Whereas the other twin always kind of gets there, but just flies by the seat of her pants. She, left medical school because she didn't want to make big decisions. She ended up working at a 7-Eleven, and through a calamity of errors ends up becoming a science teacher back at home in her rural hometown. And her father has begun to get dementia or Alzheimer's and doesn't really want to admit it. He is the doctor for the town. So she goes back to the town and ends up starting up with this guy, Lloyd. I had to look because I couldn't remember what his name was. I know that he is of Native American descent of some kind, or perhaps, I believe it's Native American. Yeah, Apache. I was like, is he Mexican or is he Apache? The Mexicans and the Indians start to mix up in the southern area where a lot of the stuff is very familiar to me. So I have a hard time discerning the Mexican-Indian divide when you get into the more southern states. And so she ends up starting a relationship with him. She has a previous history with him, which we learn about. There's some cockfighting, which horrible, could not deal with. I had to skip parts of this book. It does end relatively soon, though, so you're not exposed to it completely throughout the book, and it is passable. So our main character, Cody, who's one of the twins, the twin that kind of just glides through life, is like doing some serious soul searching. She's shacking up with this guy. She's got a boyfriend back home. I don't even know why we mentioned the boyfriend back home, which I'm not even sure now was Minnesota or Idaho or Iowa. It was somewhere in the Midwest, and he serves no purpose. There's absolutely no purpose served by this guy except to say that she spent time in Crete being his live-in girlfriend. And that was the part where I was like, Kingsolver, you're better than this. And I think that's what I came away with from this book, is that out of the stuff I've read by Barbara Kingsolver, this was probably one of the weaker ones. I liked the Lacuna. The Poisonwood Bible blew my mind. I continue to love it. That is a be-all and end-all. And I know I've read this one before, and now I know why I hadn't remembered anything. It's because it's not worth it. I do remember bits of the Bean Trees, which I read, and I want to reread that and see what I felt about it, because I recall that the main character, Turtle, was very engaging. And the fact that I can recall the main character of a book I read when I was like 15, and I can't recall the main characters of this book, and I just finished it, kind of tells you where it sits in the in the pile. I'll keep it, and I might reread it at some point, but probably not. It was a good read. It's a good summer read if you just want to read something on a beach and forget about it. But too many one-dimensional characters thrown in there for the sake of being thrown in there. Could have lived without it. The other book, because these guys are like 56 pages, so I feel kind of ashamed calling them books, but they are called books, and they're acknowledged, so I'm just going to say these are books. So the other larger book I read is Ellen Foster by Kay Gibbons. And, you know, the funny thing is I had to look up the date. This was published, it was copyrighted in 1987. This is a 1990 edition. And it's got some great blurbs by Eudora Welty, Alice Hoffman, Jonathan Yardley. Our main character has a life that seems... It's almost setting up like one of those really passive protagonists like Dickens makes, like Oliver Twist, where you just keep kicking them and they keep taking it and just kind of like going through everything like a little idiot. That's kind of how I felt about Ellen Foster. Like, everything goes wrong and everything goes bad. And I was attracted to the book because the intro, the first lines are, when I was little, I would think of ways to kill my daddy. I would figure out this or that way and run it down through my head until it got easy. And I thought, okay, this should be interesting. This should be a good take. Except that she keeps making excuses for her father, who ends up the reason her mother gets killed. There's a lot of domestic abuse and violence. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we're all using the N-word. And I had to think, is this character African American? Like, what? The writer is white. If you can write okay about African American people and you're white, I don't really care, but you're doing a piss poor job. Piss poor. In the 80s, this is not acceptable. The late 80s, early 90s, no. I don't care what you're trying to imbue upon the audience. Like, I think it takes place in Alabama. I don't know. And it took me almost the entirety of the book to figure out that even though they were using the N-word, the main character was white. She was actually insulting other people. It's used as a racial slur against her friend's family. She even goes as far as to say that the Christmas gift that they lovingly get her because she's friends with their little daughter is really cool because it doesn't look like an N-word bought it. And at that point, I was just like, I can't even. Like, it's so poorly written in that regard. Like, Alice Hoffman, Eudora Welty, what are you thinking? Lively humor, compassion, and integrity. The honesty of thought and eye and feeling and word. No, this could have been done better, okay? As a woe-begotten orphan who ends up in the foster system, hence Ellen Foster, there's so many different ways this could have gone, but she just seems to float from one crappy family member to the next crappy family member to the next crappy family member, watching everybody die, and treating the African American cast in this book poorly, and like, is it supposed to give me the feeling of the 60s? Like, is that what I'm supposed to get from this? I know her father was a bootlegger who abused her mother, who ultimately took too many pills and never woke up. Her mother's family wanted nothing to do with her until she ended up living with a teacher, and that was not cool because the teacher was basically becoming a foster parent to her, so they took her away from the teacher and placed her in her mother's family's possession. They treated her like crap until they died. And she ended up in the actual foster system, where she got a real mother, and life became good. And she had her little black friend over for a sleepover, and that makes everything okay. A Southern Holden Caulfield. That one's going away. Okay, so then Little Black Classics, which I'm going to touch on only briefly unless they need more, because this is getting long. The first one by Giovanni Boccaccio, Mrs. Rosie and the Priest. This is excerpts from the Decameron, which everybody is currently reading. And I enjoyed a couple of them. I would read the Decameron after reading these. I liked Patient Griselda. I liked Mrs. Rosie and the Priest. Andreuccio de Perugia's Neapolitan Adventure was meh, and Riccardo de Cinzia Loses His Wife wasn't that great. But out of it, 3 out of 4 I enjoyed. They're just, as described, bawdy tales of pimps, cuckolds, lovers, and clever women from the 14th century Florentine masterpiece, the Decameron. So would I read the Decameron based off of these? Yes, I would. Up next, Gerard Manley Hopkins as Kingfishers Catch Fire. This is primarily a little bit of poetry, and then at the end there's an previously unpublished extract from Hopkins's journals, and I have learned I do not like Gerard Manley Hopkins. I think I've read more of him before, but this was just a little too much not what I like. And it was the wrong time for me also. Like, forcing myself to read poetry is very hard. Considered unpublishable in his lifetime, the Victorian priest's groundbreaking experimental verse on nature's glory and despair. I actually found it to be just a little too religious. He's a priest, I get it, but it was just... I was over it. Then, the Saga of Gunnlaug Serpent Tongue, and this was translated by Katrina C. Atwood, and it made me want to read more. This is the Saga of Gunnlaug, and he is promised Helga the Fair by her father, and he goes off and does not return in time, so her father ends up giving her away to another man. There's a duel, they fight, subsequently she ends up with a third man, and of course all this was foretold in the dream of a traveling man her father met. So, giant Icelandic saga that runs the gamut, and very enjoyable if you like sagas from that era. Ranging across Scandinavia, England, and Ireland, a Viking Age epic of two poets in a doomed pursuit of Helga the Fair. Helga really doesn't show up very much in this, but the poets are awesome. And they do a lot of poet battles. Battle of poems, if you will. Then I read Thomas de Quincey's On Murder Considered One of the Fine Arts. And this reminded me of Swift's thing where he said we should eat the children. And it even references that. I forget what it was called. What the heck was that called? Because I know Swift did that. And I found it a bit on the boring side, and I didn't think it was humorous. It wasn't as humorous as Swift. And I think I know what he was trying to get at, but I'm not sure he did it as well as he could have. It was... The provocative early 19th century essayist casts a black comic eye over the aesthetic of murder through the ages. I did not interpret it that way. I thought it needed a little bit more. It could be the fact that it was 19th century and I got a little hung up on certain things. I also thought that... Is there a translation? Is this translated? No, it's not translated. I thought there could have been more exposition. So this is originally a lecture. But yeah, there could have been a lot more exposition. I wanted more footnotes in this. I think this is a text that would be beneficial to not read in this format, but actually to read with footnotes and some exposition as to what the heck is going on through most of it, because he does like to talk in different languages, including Latin and Greek, which is fine, but I don't speak Latin and Greek. I'm not as good as Steve Donahue, and I'm just not. And I need more. It's too much in a small bit, not enough background. I need more. And the one I read last night, and I'm going to start a new one tonight, and every other night. The last one I read last night was Friedrich Nietzsche, Aphorisms on Love and Hate. I actually thought it was pretty good. I have read other Nietzsche. Nietzsche can be a bit of a struggle. You can end up swimming through Nietzsche and still wondering what the heck you just read. I enjoyed parts of it. I thought parts of it were very apt. When it came to stuff that had to do with women and marriage, I completely disagreed with him. But I'm a 21st century female or a 20th century female. I don't know. Where do I fall in the category spectrum? I'm not a millennial. I'm the generation right before the millennials. Like, I think we're classed with, like, we're the millennials or something. Zillennials. Either way. I felt that certain parts were like, no. Seriously, Proteus nature. For the sake of love, women wholly become what they are in the imagination of the men who love them. Somewhere there is a feminist weeping. And so, like, there is a lot of stuff on marriage. I have absolutely no fault in believing he probably never had a good marriage and was never happily married, or even saw the validation of marriage. He tends to say that marriage is only marriage because of religion, and that you shouldn't live together, and it's just, there's a lot going on there. He speaks a lot of malice that I enjoyed. This one was translated by Marion Faber and Stephen Lehman. I'm not sure if they're known as good ones. Where is it? Where's the... This is one of my favorites, though, and I'm going to read it to you. Learning to love. We must learn to love, learn to be kind, and this from earliest youth. If education or chance gives us no opportunity to practice these feelings, our souls become dry and unsuited, even to understanding the tender invitations of loving people. Likewise, hatred must be learned and nurtured. If one wishes to become a proficient hater, otherwise the germ for that, too, will gradually wither. I think that's very apt for this climate. So I enjoyed this a lot more than I enjoyed the murder one, and I think this one didn't have any exposition really, and I didn't think it needed it. For a starter for Nietzsche, it would be great. But if you actually care more about getting into his philosophies, actually grab a whole book, not just this little guy. But I am really enjoying these snippets. I think they are adding to my to-read list. Sadly, I am going to put down The Cancer Ward by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which I was reading with Biblioatlas. I'm sorry, but I'm having medical issues, my cat's having medical issues, my brother's in the hospital. It's a little too close to home right now. So I'm going to put that down and start reading some Victober or some stuff I have that's more suited to the creepy mood rather than dealing with like medical stuff, because that's just too hard on me right now. So I will see everybody again next week, and I hope you enjoy this. I hope you enjoy the upcoming 80 days, 80 books craziness. Bye.